Hello, I'd like to welcome everybody to the Congressional Robotics Caucus webinar. And I want to welcome everybody and begin by thanking Representative Doyle for his leadership in Congress, championing the field of robotics, including co-founding the Congressional Robotics Caucus, which brought us all here together, and leading it as the only member who's remained a co-chair since its inception. The launch of the Robotic Caucus in 2007 was a seminal moment in the advancement of this field, accelerating advancements in research, as well as the growth of the robotics industry. As its founding co-chair, Congressman Doyle drafted and won passage of the resolution that established National Robotics Week, which has been wildly successful, a robotics event that is now happening each April in all 50 states in the United States. The caucus also led the rollout of the first robotics research roadmap to Congress, developed by leading researchers that paved the way for the National Robotics Initiative, a highly successful, multi-year, multi-agent, coordinated federal research agenda launched in 2011. Led by NSF, it engaged NASA, USDA, NIH, DOE, and DoD, accelerating the research and development of robotics and spawning an entire industry of robotic-driven startups and industry, particularly in Congressman Doyle's and now my hometown of Pittsburgh. Robotic Caucus is also critically served to engage and educate Congress through briefings, demonstrations, bringing robots, large and small, to the Capitol over the years, as well as showcasing winning student robotic teams who are more inspired by having their achievements recognized and celebrated in the halls of Congress. Finally, Congressman Doyle has been a relentless supporter of the federal funding for robotics research. As we reflect on these achievements and look around at what they have catalyzed across the country, including regional robotic clusters represented here today, we are pleased to have this opportunity to say thank you to Congressman Doyle for his work to honor this legacy by having the discussion today about how we will build on that legacy going forward. So I want to hand it off to Congressman Doyle and again, pass along my personal thanks to him.
Well, Matt, thank you very much. You know, this is a bittersweet moment for me, as it's probably the last Robotics Caucus event I'll attend as one of the caucus co-chairs. As you mentioned, Matt, Congressman Zach Wamp and I started this caucus in 2007. And at that point, the US robotics industry was vibrant and growing strongly, but we understood that its future would depend nevertheless on policies that were adopted by the federal government. We established the Congressional Robotics Caucus in order to promote national policies that would make the United States a leader in robotics technology and foster a strong advanced manufacturing sector in our nation, and ensure that American workers had the knowledge and skills to pursue good paying careers in advanced manufacturing. And I believe we've been successful in achieving those goals, but there's much more that needs to be done in the coming years to help the field continue to grow. Our country historically has been a country of inventors and innovators, and our nation's grown the fastest when we've embraced change. And that's how the United States became a leader in countless fields of science and industry, and how we became the industrial powerhouse of the 20th century and the arsenal of democracy in 2 world wars. Few cities in this country reflect our nation's history of scientific progress and economic growth as much as Pittsburgh, which I've had the honor of representing in Congress for the past 28 years. Pittsburgh is still associated with steel, and we're proud of our manufacturing heritage and of manufacturing's continued role in our local economy. But today, our economy is much more diverse, and that's a good thing. We've been blessed with world-class researchers at our local universities who have made Pittsburgh a national and world leader in fields like computers, healthcare, and of course, robotics. We've also benefited from community leaders who decades ago recognized the need to build a new economy based on our greatest competitive advantage, the research being conducted in our region by universities like Carnegie Mellon and Pitt, and the new technologies and products spun off from that research. Researchers in Pittsburgh win more than $1 billion in federal research grants every year, and the research projects those grants fund produce a remarkable number of patents and startup companies. As a result, high tech has played an important role in our region's economy in recent years, and I believe it will continue to do so. As a member of Congress who started representing the region in Congress soon after the local steel industry collapsed, I've always worked to promote job creation and economic development in our region. And given the intellectual capital and infrastructure we've already got in place in terms of robotics technology, it just made sense that our elected officials work to grow this promising local industry. And as a member of Congress, I've tried to do just that. I believe the Robotics Caucus has helped promote robotics technology in Congress. You know, innovation is a vital part of the American economy. And as a country and a people, we constantly strive to develop new technology that will give us new tools to achieve new goals. But our success and leadership in these areas is not absolute. And we face serious competition from other nations looking to take the lead and become the cradle of development for the next generation of breakthrough technologies. Our ability as a nation to maintain our leadership depends on our government's commitment to invest in basic research and to invest in the educating and training of the next generation of researchers, engineers, and entrepreneurs. You know, when Raj Reddy and Anwar Jordan and Tom Murren created the Robotics Institute back in 1979, they had a dream that Carnegie Mellon University could become one of the world's leaders in robotics. Over the past 2.5 decades, that dream has become a reality. From intelligent manufacturing to autonomous vehicles to space exploration, Carnegie Mellon University has indeed become a world leader in robotics technology. And since 1979, Carnegie Mellon's Robotics Institute has attracted researchers, students, and businesses to the Pittsburgh region to study at the world's premier center for robotics research. Today, robots play an important role in our regional economy and will play an even greater role in the future. Consequently, I want to acknowledge the Robotics Institute founders' tremendous contribution to our region and the nation. Their vision has resulted in Pittsburgh becoming a global leader in robotics research and development. I've been a strong supporter of the Robotics Institute throughout my service in Congress, and I firmly believe that robotics and advanced manufacturing technology is critical for our regions and our nation's future economic growth. Fortunately, the remarkable vision behind the Robotics Institute continues to this day. We have seen the robotics companies in Pittsburgh achieve a critical mass and become a robotics ecosystem that produces synergies that benefit all of the research, development, and commercialization going on in our region. And as a part of that process, they formed a regional organization, the Pittsburgh Robotics Network. This same growth of regional clusters has taken place in other parts of the country as well, in Massachusetts, in Silicon Valley, for example. These regional robotics clusters can be models for the other cities that are homes to companies and research universities involved in robotics, so that they can contribute more to the robotics innovation going on in the United States. Representatives from the Pittsburgh Robotics Network, Mass Robotics, and Silicon Valley Robotics will talk today about their accomplishments, as well as their vision for a nationwide alliance to advocate for robotics research and innovation going forward. Today's discussion will address where we are, what challenges we face, and what the government can do to promote robotics development, production, and adoption in the United States. These are the same issues that the Robotics Caucus has been concerned about throughout its existence. And we're fortunate to have a number of highly respected experts here today to share their perspectives on the implication of these changes. I want to especially recognize Joel Reed, Executive Director of the Pittsburgh Robotics Network, who's been doing outstanding work in expanding the network and helping to bring together the clusters of robotic startups around the nation. So, on behalf of the Congressional Robotics Caucus, I want to thank our distinguished guests for agreeing to share their insights with us today. In closing, I want to say it's been an honor and a privilege to co-chair the Congressional Robotics Caucus over the last 15 years. And rest assured that I'll continue to follow the progress of our nation's robotics industry with great interest, even after my departure from Congress. Thank you and enjoy the webinar today.
Thank you so much, Congressman Doyle. We really appreciate all your service in advancing robotics. I want to use the opportunity to tell you a little bit about myself and how I got into robotics. So I'm Matthew Johnson Robertson. I'm the director of Carnegie Mellon's Robotics Institute. And as Congressman Doyle highlighted, it's been around for almost 40 years. And what's really amazing about the Robotics Institute is it has really transformed the field of robotics from just a pure fundamental research domain to one in which we see this technology translating into industry, into startup companies, and really transforming Pittsburgh on whole. I came to Carnegie Mellon as an undergrad, and I actually didn't know what I wanted to do. And it was Carnegie Mellon that turned me around and really focused me on robotics as a field to study. And I don't think I even knew what robotics was in a real sense until I showed up here. And it changed the whole trajectory of my career. So I went into robotics as an academic, and I've been really honored to be able to come back and direct this center that gave so much to me. I've been asked to speak about sort of the R&D perspective. And so, I want to underscore the Congressman's comments to say that investing in fundamental research is so critically important to the continued sort of advancement of the field and also advancement of economic interest for the United States. If you look at sort of the technologies that we've seen rolled out that, get so much media attention now and are such a vibrant part of the Pittsburgh ecosystem, things like self-driving cars, those technologies have been part of the fundamental research landscape here at CMU and elsewhere around the world, for over 30 years. And so it's very humbling to walk down the halls and to see projects on self-driving cars that were developed here in the 1980s, and to think about how long that journey is to reaching some semblance of commercial viability. And so what that really highlights to me is sort of, investing in these fundamental research technologies can lead to sort of untold potential in future. And we realize that the sort of knock-on effects and the sort of advancements that we see in technology now are really a consequence of these investments in fundamental R&D many years ago. And the second thing I'll highlight here is that, one of the biggest impacts that I think this technology has had is training a whole new generation of people that are passionate about science and technology and robotics, and really inspiring young people to want to go on and innovate and do new things. And so I think that inspiration, that excitement around robotics, the sort of energy it generates in young people is such an incredibly important thing for us to continue to nurture, because what it means is that you end up with adults that have a real passion for what they want to do and a real vision to change the world. And so, from my perspective, I think we're at an inflection point in robotics where we're seeing much of the robotic technology that's being developed or has been developed over the last 20 years, translating now into having impacts to people's day-to-day lives. And I think the narrative around robotics is beginning to change. I think people understand now that robotics are not segregated from human beings, but need to really interact with human beings regularly. And that sort of interplay between robot and human in sort of the modern workplace, I think, is going to be the thing that defines the next 20 years of robotics. So I'm particularly excited for us to continue to think about what the future of robotics can be here at Carnegie Mellon and elsewhere. But more importantly, I think that the transformation we're going to see in the United States and around the world in focusing on how this technology can make people's lives better is going to be an important piece of, again, what dominates this next generation's experience of the world. So with that, I want to hand off to Jeff, who's going to tell us a bit about the historical perspective about how robotics has developed in the United States and really where the industry is going next. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I lead a trade association called the Association for Advancing Automation. It's been around for over 50 years and nearly 50. When I got involved, robotics was going to be the next industrial revolution. That was 40 years ago. Well, I think it's finally starting to happen. We are at an inflection point, as Matt said. It's one of the reasons that our membership has grown to over 1,100 companies, because we're seeing the adoption of robotics accelerate well beyond where it started. It started in the 1960s, primarily in the automotive industry. But now look at where robots are being used. Warehousing and distribution, agriculture, construction, retail, restaurants, healthcare. It's hard to think of an industry that isn't adopting robotics now. And it's all over the world. So this inflection point is extremely important for the American government to take leadership. As Congressman Doyle said, by the way, of all the people I've worked with in Congress, Congressman Doyle understands this better than anyone, that robotics can help make America more competitive. We need the programs that Matt talked about in terms of funding more research, but we also need to create incentives for companies to automate, to make it easier for them to automate, to talk about automation as a good thing in terms of helping create new jobs. The congressman talked about what's happening in Pittsburgh. It's happening all over the country, that robotics are enabling better, safer, and higher paying jobs. And this is the future. It's people and robots working together. And I'm so glad you talked about that, Matt, because the most important part of any robotic solution is the people. Now, it's highly competitive out there globally. Other governments are investing more heavily than the United States. China in particular has emerged as a leader in robotics. Japan has been a leader for decades. They're continuing to invest heavily. Other countries like Korea, same thing. In the US, we need to match that passion for robotics that these countries are showing at the national level. We certainly have it in terms of innovation. You're going to hear from our cluster partners today. We have leadership in not only robotics, but in artificial intelligence, machine vision, many other areas that enable robots to do all the great things that they're doing today. In the future, there's endless opportunities for robots to make our lives better in areas like elder care and home robotics. We're at the very early stages, despite the fact that this technology has been around over 50 years. There's still so much more that we can accomplish, so many difficult challenges that we can help solve with robotics. And in terms of people who are worried about this is going to take away jobs, I want to assure you, we've looked at this over several decades. It's really interesting that whenever robot sales go up, unemployment goes down. And when robot sales go down, unemployment goes up. You can just look at the last decade, this greatest explosion of robotic use that we've seen ever in the United States, unemployment's fallen to below 4%. So it's a really exciting time to be involved. We're looking forward to the rest of the discussion today and to work together with industry, academia, and of course, government to make sure that American leadership is sustained. So thank you for having me on the panel.
Thanks, Jeff. So next, we're going to go to Joel, Tom, and Andra to talk about sort of the regional clusters and how this has been a model for innovation here in the United States. And they can kind of each speak to the different regional and unique strengths and give us some perspective on what's happening sort of, more broadly.
Hi, Chip. How are you?
Okay. I mean, I've had.
All right, Matt, I guess maybe I can lead.
Sounds great.
Or Andra, do you want to go?
Well, thank you very much, Joel and Matt. I will just give a little bit of a follow-on from what Jeff was saying. We are absolutely at an inflection point. And as the managing director of Silicon Valley Robotics, being over on the West Coast, I think in some ways we may have seen this inflection point even more closely than if we, were one of the clusters on the East Coast, because over here, nobody realizes just how much robotics is happening in the Bay Area. We are the little fish in a very big pond of other technological innovation. And yet the roots of robotics go back all the way to the 60s, to the development of the first programmable universal machine for assembly, the Puma robot arm that happened at Stanford. And we've been lucky enough to have access to all of the learnings that have gone along with the software startup revolution. And these things combined with robotics are leading us to successful innovation, or at least the commercialization of innovation. And this being a really critical point here, we are now commercializing innovation in robotics at a far greater pace than at any other time in the history of the entire robotics field. In fact, in the last 10 years, more robotics companies have been formed than in the entire history of robotics, going back past the 60s. So there are now thousands of robotics companies worldwide, And the US is leading in terms of the growth of these new innovation-based technology companies. And we're seeing that real inflection point where the fundamental research that Matt and Jeff talked about, that Congressman Doyle has been such a champion of, this fundamental research, the ball is being picked up by industry, who are also investing significantly into the research and development of robotics. And we should not fail to continue supporting this investment into fundamental R&D. That is one critical thing that we must continue to do, because the US, relatively speaking, has dropped back to 8th or 9th in the world, with many countries now targeting explicitly this innovative robotics technology space as being the focus for their R&D efforts. We have achieved world thought leadership and world leadership in the innovation and commercialization of new robotics technologies. And yet we are at risk of falling behind if we do not support what is still a relatively new. Most robotics companies did not exist 5 to 10 years ago. This is a relatively new and fragile industry. We formed a cluster association in the Silicon Valley region to support this commercialization of innovation. And we've joined our fellow clusters, Pittsburgh Robotics Network, Pittsburgh Robotics and Mass Robotics, in coming together as the US Alliance of Robotics Clusters to help support the growth of other regional clusters and to provide a national voice for the wide range of robotics that is being generated in these regions. And we are seeing robotics in agriculture. We're seeing robotics in aerospace. We're seeing robotics in biotech and biomanufacturing. We're seeing robotics in construction. We're seeing it in health, in home, in logistics, and in retail. There is not a single industry that is not starting to be aware of the benefits of adopting robotics and automation technologies. Now, I will go one step further and say that robotics protects jobs. As Jeff pointed out, when robotics adoption goes up, unemployment goes down. I will go one step further and say that robotics enhances productivity and competitiveness, and the companies that do not adopt become uncompetitive and they shut down. So the safest thing to be doing at the moment is to be adopting robotics and automation to maintain competitiveness. And my biggest concern is that we're not doing enough to support the small, medium enterprises. All of the Fortune 500s have been engaged in adopting robotics and automation technologies over the last 10 years. How do we democratize this access to the technologies? And we're going to hear a little bit more about the roles that robotics can play in supporting our sustainable development goals and meeting other regional and national and global challenges from my fellow robotics clusters, Mass Robotics and Pittsburgh Robotics Network.
Great, thanks, Andrea. And I want to echo a lot of what Jeff and Andrea said. So I'm Tom Ryden. I'm the Executive Director of Mass Robotics. We're a nonprofit based in Boston that supports the robotics industry. We also run an innovation center in downtown Boston that houses over 65 companies, young startups that are developing all sorts of technology. We're one of the largest innovation centers in the world, if not the largest. And it's amazing the breadth of technology that's being developed here. As Jeff and Andrea mentioned, traditionally you think of automation, you think of factories, and now recently warehouses, but we're seeing developments across the board. We're seeing an amazing amount in agriculture, how to automate things like picking and weeding and fertilizing, better utilizing the resources, the natural resources we have. We're seeing companies in medical field, whether it's surgical robotics, assistive robotics. It's amazing that these tools can be used to help people lead a longer and more sustained life. We're seeing companies in consumer and other areas as well. And so I think that breadth of robotics is really important because it indicates how this industry can impact virtually any other industry. I will say that I went to visit China a while ago, and I was impressed with the amount of investment they were putting into robotics. And I talked to some of the diplomats there, and I asked them, I said, isn't this a concern about what we hear in the US is that robots take jobs? And they said, we have to invest. We have to remain competitive. We realize that China is not going to be the low-cost provider. This work is going outside. How can we remain competitive? It is investing in robotics. I think we in the US have to take that same approach. For our companies to remain competitive across the board, they have to be involved in robotics. It's really the way of the future. They will not keep up with international companies that are making these investments. And to Andra's point, small and mid-sized enterprises is really where we have to focus. The larger companies, they can invest, they can understand how this technology is being developed. They have the resources and the skills. But some of these small and mid-sized manufacturers are struggling to understand this technology and adopt it. We're involved currently in a U.S. Economic Development Agency grant, Department of Commerce grant, around doing exactly that, helping young companies understand this new technology. And we believe that there's a great opportunity for even more investment and development of these young companies and getting them to understand and deploy this technology so they remain competitive. And I'll turn it over to Joel.
Thank you, Tom, Andra, Matt, appreciate it. My name is Joel Reed. I currently serve as the Executive Director of the Pittsburgh Robotics Network. I want to start by thanking Congressman Doyle, along with others, such as Patty Rhoda of Carnegie Mellon University and founder of Girls of Steel, Kevin Dowling, Sanjeev Singh, Jackie Erickson. These are the folks that were my predecessors who formed the Pittsburgh Robotics Network and are responsible for creating this world-leading ecosystem in Pittsburgh. In 2016, Congressman Doyle worked with our local leaders to showcase the region and the country's growth as a part of an event called RoboPGH. At that time, Pittsburgh counted approximately 30 commercial businesses and about 2,200 workers. Just last year, our network announced its 100th commercial robotics business operating in Pittsburgh, and that number has grown by 10 new organizations in just a year. Additionally, a recent survey looking at the local ecosystem found that we have 7,000 people directly employed in the robotics and autonomous systems sector, with indirect employment totaling upwards to 14,000 employees. This is one of the faster growing segments of the economy and one of the biggest economic opportunities in Pittsburgh. But I want to make a point that it's not just college degree jobs, as many might think. I most recently served as CEO of a company in Pittsburgh called I Am Robotics, which is a pioneer in supply chain solutions that's addressing these worldwide labor shortage crises that you may be aware of and which some of my colleagues have mentioned. At the time, in 2017, we were 12 engineers. Today, that company employs 100 employees. A large number of those new hires come in conventional commercial roles like project managers, marketing, HR, purchasing. But we also had to build a capacity to test, assemble, ship, install, and service these solutions. Robotics are not programmers just sitting in cubicles. It's real-world machines and equipment that perform a wide range of important functions. In Pittsburgh, our companies and our strengths are both broad and deep. And forgive me if I read from a list of the different areas where we tout some strengths, from constructing new roads and accelerating construction in other sectors, keeping our supply chain running and resilient, performing complicated surgeries in healthcare, producing more affordable and healthy food, strengthening our national defense, improving mobility, but while reducing the overall environmental and climate change impact, and even expanding space exploration. And for all of this and working with these real world solutions, we need skilled technicians who can not only work as mechanical and electrical engineers, but who also have the ability to diagnose, maintain, repair, and operate computer-based systems. In my personal experience, this was one of the more difficult positions to hire, but it represents one of the bigger opportunities. Robotics technicians and engineer job classifications are growing, while other jobs are in decline. And we need help in developing that workforce. Also, as we learned during the pandemic, we need to develop a more resilient supply chain by developing onshore supply relationships. And finally, we have the opportunity to leverage our skilled workforce in this country to manufacture these solutions right here in the United States. I want to thank Andra for spearheading the U.S. Alliance of Clusters and bringing together these top 3 regions in robotics development that are recognized as some of the top in the world. We at the Pittsburgh Robotics community, are proud to be a founding member and a leading region. In this, what is now known as a global economy, some think that location matters less. However, the exact opposite is true. By concentrating assets and making investments in specialized skills, active and engaged business networks, bringing in complementary and supportive industries, and having leading customers and thought leaders, this creates economic advantages for our country. And we believe government has a stake and should play a critical role in developing this expanded ecosystem. And this includes investments in education, support for workforce development, and leadership in creating a national dialogue around the opportunity. I believe robotics are a new class of equipment. They are machines. We're one of the world's leader in other segments like this, from tractors to airplanes, and those tools spawned entire new industries and scores of jobs in adjacent economies. Robotics is doing the same thing. But as it was mentioned before, and I'll echo it in closing, there's a real urgency. As both Jeff and Tom and Andra have mentioned, other countries and regions around the world are making significant investments. If you look at a country like Denmark, in just 10 years, their robotics cluster has become one of the world's leading robotics clusters, and it's a jumping off point for selling solutions in Europe. So in some ways, we have to catch up to these regions who lead on adoption and commercial development. And research has shown that government policy on taxes, regulatory policies, and workforce investment does play a key role in being competitive. So I want to thank everybody for being here today, and we look forward to working with new government partners in the coming months and years. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I want to hand it off now to Rich, who's going to tell us about sort of expanding the STEM pipeline.
Thank you. Yeah, the pipeline across the country, there is a pipeline K to 12, K to grade, we call it, but it's very narrow, and there's pockets of excellence around the country. You know, we've seen the need for program expanding that starts as early as first grade with Project Lead the Way, Vex Robotics, First Lego League, First Robotics, SME ARM, and 4-H and others have developed programming that goes K to 12 and K to grade. But our biggest hindrance is always professional development for teachers. And how do we get the curriculum into the schools, the programs, the libraries, the clubs, the homeschools, all the organizations that are interested in robotics, and how do we get the equipment in there, as well as find champions who can expand the programming. And throughout my background was Ramtech, Ohio. We started 24 robotic K to grade industrial robotic training centers that included automation, Industry 4.0 applications in 2013. Some of our biggest needs with industry were trained teachers, the same as colleges face, is that we can train teachers up to teach robotics and automation, but then, you know, capitalism sets in and they can make 2 or 3 times the money in the private sector. So there's been some training centers developed with grants through ARM and other organizations to help train teachers and to provide support. But really what we see is at the lower levels where we need to attract the students, we need to do a better job of creating small win requirement that are required through state and national requirements for teachers, some of the standards that'll apply to what they need to be taught. Also, we need to take the best practices from around the country and make sure that those are supported and showcased so they can be implemented. You know, some states doing some great things that I've personally been involved with: Alabama, Florida, Kentucky, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Texas, Arizona, and Tennessee all have put a great emphasis in the last 5 years to 10 years on robotics automation, and they've provided funding for the budgets for that. But a lot of times the funding isn't to support the training of teachers and the expansion of experts into the field. One of the things we feel is needed done is that industry and the government funding, we need to create experts from industry mentors that can come into facilities like career centers, industrial art program, colleges, clubs, and help teach and model what needs to be done in industry, not just the robots you see in my background, because Yaskawa, Fanuc, ABB, Universal Robots, they all do a great job now creating industrial credentials that can be delivered to high school level, and training, and states are latching onto that. But also the other areas of robotics, drones. Drones is a big movement right now for EVs, UAVs, all that is in the robotics sector. It all needs to have curriculum and programs created to implement that in schools. We need 4th through 12th graders to embrace that technology. And one of the last things I've recently worked on is, I don't know if any of you know that 4-H has national robotics books starting for 3rd graders. We're rewriting those books to make it so that they're exposed to industry and the latest and greatest robotic initiatives for programming and robotics. SME, Society of Manufactured Robots, building a credential that will take educational robots, link them to industrial robots, so they can go into schools, and anybody industry needs upskilled, they understand the terminology and they can take a test and get an industry credential that shows that they have industry knowledge, but also it makes them easier to get employed. The ARM Institute has roboticscareer.org out of Pittsburgh. It's doing a great job linking up training centers with industry. There's a lot happening nationally, but we're always willing to embrace industry, and we need more government funding and more money on the standpoint of, we have early adopters that love and embrace robotics, but we need to expand that into all K-12s. Project Lead the Way has 8,000 schools nationally. VEX has 1 million students worldwide in their organizations, them in FIRST. But we have a pipeline. We just need to expand that as much as we can.
Great. That's excellent. Thanks, everybody. So what we wanted to do now is actually kick it off to a bit of a panel discussion, hopefully dives into some of these issues with a little bit more depth. So we're going to try to field some questions from the chat as available, but let me start off the panel with the following question, right? So, we've seen lots of discussion at the sort of national level around AI. And so perhaps one way that we can sort of help to talk about the bounds of what we're discussing here is maybe describe sort of how the robotics R&D applications are distinct from AI as a whole category, and why we think that there's still a focus and a need for thinking about robotics as its own discipline.
That's a really excellent point, Matt, and I'm really glad that you've raised that, because at the moment there is a little bit of a risk of robotics being subsumed into the AI agenda, and while it intersects quite significantly, and you could argue that AI is actually a subset of robotics, but really these two things, they intersect, and they each have particular challenges and strengths that are not the same. In the case of robotics, it is physical. It is physically in the world in a very different way to AI. And as such, it poses everything from greater safety concerns to greater opportunities to be doing real work in the world, ranging from the sustainable development goals that we talked about, to reshoring manufacturing, to reducing the environmental impacts. These are things that we are really not on the AI agenda as such. And these are all goods that we are seeing coming out of the developments in robotics. So we definitely do not want robotics to be lost in the AI discussion. I'm sure the other panelists will be able to say more about that.
Well, I'm happy to weigh in on that. I mean, I think that robotics needs to have more visibility within the government as its own set of technologies, which I would agree that AI is an enabler of robotic applications is important to talk about. I think that if you look at what companies really want to accomplish, okay, in America or anywhere else, they want to be more productive. They want to build better quality products. They want to get them to market faster. Robots are essential to those tasks. AI is an enabler of those tasks, but robotics has its own place in this world that needs to be treated as such. Governments around the world recognize that, and the US government needs to recognize that too. AI is not even clear when you talk about AI what we mean. You know, are we talking about machine learning? Are we talking about predictive maintenance of our machines? All those things are important, but robotics should be at the forefront in our thinking. We need more leaders in government who understand robots, who understand how it can make our companies more competitive.
I was just going to add, Matt, that I'm a little shy answering that question because you probably know the answer better than all of us.
I'm just here to referee.
I've always looked at it as this physical interaction and interface layer, and AI is a part of it. And I would agree that in many ways we're a subset. And I also agree it needs a dedicated attention because robotics is this complicated interplay between, computer science, mechanical engineering, electronics, battery technology, but also human interface programming. You know, how do these new pieces of technology collaborate with humans to help them, in their jobs? So even, human-centered design. So I do believe that it is different and distinct from a broader classification of artificial intelligence.
And I would agree with Joel. I would agree with Joel. I think we often get, we hear that AI, especially in something like RPA, robotic process automation, which really has nothing to do with robotics, but it uses robot in the name. It's more a way to optimize financial transactions. So we have to be really aware of how AI that is used for robotics is very different than in fintech or any other area. And we should keep those distinct.
Maybe I'll try to circle back to a point that was brought up earlier in the conversation. So, for this audience, I think one of the most important things for them is they all represent different regions around the United States. And they're really, really focused, as their constituents are, around economic development, job creation, and job growth. So, we've touched on this, but I think I want to circle back because I do think it's important for some of this panel to underscore this point. Can we talk about sort of the perhaps misperception that robots are direct replacements for jobs that people are doing right now? And let's kind of try to paint a picture for what an economy looks like in future with many more robots and how that, and I'll leave it to the panel, but how they believe that relates to sort of the economic opportunities that would afford to different parts of the United States.
I will say that robots don't take jobs. Robots do tasks. No robot is capable of the sophistication of the least educated person. We are capable of doing things like opening doors and climbing stairs without writing it on our resumes. And yet it is a rare robot that is capable of doing either of those two tasks. And this is one of the fundamental misunderstandings. Even if a robot looks humanoid, it is incapable of doing the wide range of skills that the average human brings with them every single day, no matter what their education or experience level is. And we call these things common sense. We don't even count them as part of a job description. And you'll find that most economic analyses of the role that robots will take in taking jobs are completely flawed when you go back and you look deeply at what jobs they're predicting will get taken. Fashion models, 99.9% likely to be replaced by robots? I don't think so. Nor chefs. There are so many inherent human qualities in most of these jobs that have not been categorized in the labor statistics. And therefore, economists grapple with making false equivalences. And we just need to knock that discussion on its head immediately. Robots do not take jobs, they do tasks. Companies that use robots increase the number of people that they hire because they are more productive and they are more competitive.
I just know in our area, in the Midwest, every factory, they can't find workers. And so if you don't automate, you perish. And then you talked about that a little bit earlier. It's so important, all the job openings there are, and we've seen it go in the food industry and everywhere else. Robots are doing the redundant jobs that people don't want to do anymore. And they're helping our economy expand. And they're helping us keep our manufacturing base and expanding it. And I'm sure Jeff just can't wait to comment on this, but we can prove it. They're keeping our manufacturing here.
All those things are true, Rich, and what Andra said, but let me try and give you an example of what this looks like, which was what Matt's question was. So the biggest driver right now is you can't find people. It doesn't matter what your industry is, finding people is difficult. Here's an example I came across recently. There's a company called RoboTire. What they're trying to do is a 4-robot system to change tires. Why? Because companies like Discount Tire have a shortage of like 5,000 technicians, okay? So if the 4-robot system could do it faster, 20 minutes as opposed to the hours it might take because of the shortage of people, could do it more accurately, think about how this would work for a person. Instead of having people whose job it is to lift heavy tires all day, right? Which, who can do that? That's not a job that I could do. That's a job that only a certain subset of the population can do all day long, every day. But who can do it if it's controlled through an iPhone app? Well, anybody could do it. That's a kind of job that I could do, my daughters could do, anyone could do. It's a better job than lifting the tire all day. It's probably overseeing the whole system is a better use of your brain. It's probably a job you'd rather do. And it's probably a higher paying job because you've got to oversee the system. That's what it looks like in the real world when you're taking robots and letting them do the jobs that they should do and letting people do what we're good at, like Andra talked about. We're good at using our mind, creating things, being chefs. If the robots can fill in on the line preparing food, that's great. But there's still more jobs, better jobs for people out there. And that's what the future looks like. So I wanted to paint that picture so that the people can understand what we're talking about. When we talk about robots doing jobs that we don't want to do, that's the kind of thing we're talking about.
And if I may, I'd like to layer on another factor, which is the scale at which some of our systems and our infrastructure and society have grown. And we're falling behind. I mean, if you think of transportation and roadway infrastructure, heavy industry and oil and gas and otherwise, I mean, we can't keep up with inspecting our bridges. This is something we know, unfortunately, all too well in the city of Pittsburgh. And so we need new technologies and new capabilities that are managed and driven by humans, but augment their ability to perform this kind of work. And those are the solutions that really are prevailing, and less so the humanoids that we see in the commercials and in the YouTube videos.
And I'll echo that with what Joel said. The fastest growing section of robotics is something called collaborative robotics or cobots. And what those are is robots that can interact and work side by side humans. So a robot can do certain things, repetitive tasks, heavy tasks, dirty tasks very well, right? And humans can do tasks really well. The greatest, I think, solution is one that combines the strengths of both. And that's what a number of companies are working on. This collaborative robot, the idea that robots and humans can work together to make everybody more productive. I think to your point and your question, Matt, that's what we see the future of.
I completely agree. And I want to just circle back to what Rich was originally talking about and double down on it that Jeff also said, and Tom, you led into this. It is the simple interfaces that we're now developing that make robotics accessible and usable by anybody. Human strength, we're good at flexibility and common sense, and we make really good robot supervisors. Robots are really good at the dirty, dull, dangerous jobs that people shouldn't be doing. And those are the areas that people are already voting with their feet to not work in. It's the labor shortages that are really forcing companies to consider robotics and automation very seriously. But we are entering a world of collaborative, usable robots that can operate alongside people and allow people to do jobs that they would prefer to do that are, generally speaking, better paid.
And we're seeing them move into the educational field with all three major, I was able to be trained on all three major companies I've talked about for cobots and compare them. And they're moving into industry, but they're moving into education, because in education, it's a lot safer to train a student on a cobot than an industrial robot. So you're seeing a lot of applications moving to the educational field as well for training.
Thanks, everybody. Maybe we'll use the remaining kind of time. I want to hit every panelist and ask a different question. Let's try to be a little prescriptive here. What can the US do? What should the US be doing to help to encourage all of the things that we're talking about here that all sound positive? Robots can help us tackle many of the challenges we have: food insecurity, aging populations, environmental issues, innovation, all these kind of things that we want to get at, that we think robots are good for. What should the US be doing to really be encouraging, fostering, nurturing this field? And what is the ask? What should we be up to? Anyone can start.
I'll go ahead and start and be brief. I think first, and I mentioned a couple things, right? Which is having a supportive tax environment, helping with regulatory policies, and partnering on those, which we're doing in our state around autonomous vehicles, and investing in a workforce. We can train adjacent workforces to be prepared to work in this industry and help drive the growth and development. I just think let's continue to support a very positive cultural mindset around this technology, embrace it as the competitive advantage that we have today, and not try to find all the reasons why this technology is going to upend economic opportunity. The exact opposite is the case, and we should work together on that positioning and that messaging, and make sure we are addressing real concerns, because I know every one of our clusters has initiatives to develop a workforce for the new economy, and for it to be broad and inclusive for all economic levels, and all gender and racial backgrounds as well. And so I think just having that public-private partnership is really critical.
One of the most important elements Joel just touched on. When the National Robotics Initiative was launched, the President of the United States launched that, President Obama. And that created this national awareness that robotics was important at the highest levels of government. Instead of saying this is a threat, we were saying, as a nation, this is something that's positive for our country's ability to compete, and that we want to support it with money and programs to help further the development of robotics. Now, with that mindset at the highest levels of government, think about what we're capable of doing. We're capable of funding basic research and applied research. We're capable of creating more national manufacturing centers around the country to help companies who want to automate. We're capable of creating incentives for small and medium-sized companies to automate, just from the standpoint of believing that it's a good thing. You can do all these things, you can fund all these things if you believe it's good, if you're not hesitant, if you're all in, like some of the other nations that we talked about are. That would provide the framework. And Rich talked about state governments doing things. That's important too, again, with the signals from the national government that this is worth doing.
I think you're on spot on that, Jeff, is that we need to make a positive movement. We need more PR nationally and from the federal government, but we also, the funding needs to trickle all the way through to the K to grade promotion of this. You know, Apple model and everybody else in education was 4th, 5th grade, get students on board with computers and that. And we need to do the same thing with robotics. The more we can help penetrate the elementary market and make robotics a positive and manufacturing positive, the better off we are. It's going to take, you got to be patient. It's 5 to 7 years to get somebody through a school system. But when they come out, if they're raring to go and they want to go in the robotics field, that's great for us because everybody's fighting for the same student right now, same person as they're educated. Everybody wants that same smart, highly motivated student, has great attendance. We've got to get them in the robotics field.
I would say, though, where robotics is very keen for anybody of any age who is interested in working in robotics. I think it's a wide open opportunity for adults to change their careers, especially as we're making robots more usable. And I just want to double down on the comments that we want to have robotics back on the executive agenda. We want it to be a state and federal focus. The US has current thought leadership in this space and is the center of innovation worldwide. But are we seeing it go to the small, medium enterprises at this stage? We could do with more support for the small, medium enterprises in their approach to robotics. I think Joel also mentioned things like R&D tax incentives or tax credits for robot adoption and support for robotics being on the agenda.
Well, thanks everybody. That's a great note to end on. So what I'll say is just that, you know, I think the impact on my career of things like the National Robotics Initiative, and as a young researcher, the ability to get money to do the fundamental research that I believe is going to, you know, change the next 20 years, I think was an incredibly important step in my career. So I'll just reiterate the points that everyone's making and say, look, let's continue to invest in robotics. I think let's continue to invest in R&D. Let's continue to invest in commercialization and distribute, again, to kind of underscore some of the points made earlier, distribute this sort of well-being and economic development as broadly across the country as we can. And so, you know, I know that robotics is at its core an incredibly inspiring and exciting field to be in. And I think the more people that we can show that to and sort of convince of the value of it, I think it's going to be an incredibly important thing for us to be doing nationally. So I want to thank everybody for all their comments and excitement. And I want to go back to continuing to thank Congressman Doyle for all his support over the years and wish him the best and, you know, playing golf or whatever he wants to do in retirement. I'm sure he'll stay busy. So with that, I'll bring this to a close. But again, thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to Congressman Doyle, and thank you to everyone for attending. I know I've learned a lot, so it's been a lot of fun. Thanks.
Thank you.